my goal today is to bring out what I take to be the core principles of modern Catholic social doctrine, and then make some observations about how the circumstances of their formulation have changed, and how we should think about them in relation to our social and political realities of today. Well, most people identify Rerum Novarum by Leo XIII, the 1891 encyclical, as the source document or the original document for modern Catholic social teaching. And in Rerum Novarum, Leo XIII identified two different dangers facing modern industrial society. One is a kind of selfish indifference to the needs of others. Selfish indifference, especially on the part of those who own industrial corporate concerns that really got going in the late 19th century. And the other is the danger of a collectivist response that to this selfish individualism, this selfish indifference, a collectivist response that absorbs the individual worker into a larger mass. And so we see that in probably the most important part of the document, a very subtle analysis of the importance of private property. Leo XIII brings out the need for both, the human person needs both independence. Private property provides a secure basis for each of us to pursue our individual life projects, and for us to provide for our families and have some independence. But at the same time, private property is, and the economic activity is an important location for social cooperation. And I think this stems from the fact that, and this gets developed in Catholic social doctrine, that human dignity has two poles. On the one pole is, core element of human dignity is freedom, and so we need to have scope for in our lives to pursue our own projects and our own initiatives, so there has to be room for human freedom. But human dignity also has a second dimension, which is the need for human solidarity. That no man is an island, we're not made to live our lives alone, but on the contrary, we realize our humanity more fully in cooperative ventures with others. And so John Paul II developed this in terms of the notion of self-gift as the highest expression of freedom. So freedom and solidarity are, I call them poles, or two elements, because I think the Catholic tradition doesn't see them in conflict with each other, but instead as complementing each other. But certainly, in terms of political questions, the imperative of freedom and the imperative of solidarity run in very different directions. But the Catholic social doctrine tradition has urged us to do justice to both the imperative of freedom and the imperative of solidarity. And this has meant warnings, as the Catholic tradition since 1891 has meant warnings against both an exaggerated and therefore false collectivism, as well as an exaggerated and therefore false individualism. So you could say freedom, if pursued in the wrong sort of way, leads to an exaggerated individualism. Solidarity, if pursued in the wrong sort of way, leads to an exaggerated collectivism. And these are the twin dangers that Catholic social teaching has warned us against, I think, pretty much continuously from 1891 to present. But there have been different emphases. In 1891, when Leo XIII published Rerum Novarum, up until Pius XII, in the 1950s, so for a good half century, most of the emphasis fell in the Catholic teaching on resisting this exaggerated collectivism in the form of polemics against communism, as well as later against nationalism. So both nationalism and communism represent this kind of exaggerated collectivism that absorbs the individual into the larger whole and neglects and often can be abused and destroy individual freedom. But that was the primary, and so the problem of exaggerated individualism in this phase was usually addressed primarily through moral exhortation to charity and responsibility. And so Leo XIII exhorts owners of factories and so forth to make responsible use of their ownership. Or later it involves support for social welfare programs, unemployment insurance, and things like that, in order to compensate for the dangers of, for larger corporate responsibility in society at large. But I think since Vatican II, since the 1960s, Catholicism has become more and more concerned about exaggerated individualism and less concerned about exaggerated collectivism. We see concerns about consumerism in Gaudium et Spes, the Pastoral Constitution of the Church from the Second Vatican Council. Humanae Vitae, the encyclical on contraception, worries about a kind of selfish hedonism. And John Paul II, I think, was especially concerned throughout his pontificate with what he called the anthropological heresy, the heresy about the human person, which he thought was characteristic of late modernity. And this heresy is a view of freedom that disintegrates into self-love, even to the point of contempt for moral truth. That's the thrust, I think, of his encyclical Veritatis Splendor, or contempt for God himself. And so this anthropological heresy, this sense that our human dignity really is us being able to do what we want, becomes more and more the focus of Catholic social teaching. Now, his experiences in Poland, obviously, made him sensitive to the dangers of exaggerated collectivism. He had no illusions about the kind of damage that the collectivist enterprises of socialism did to the human person and the kind of crimes against the human person that were perpetrated in its name. But I think he recognized that the threat of collectivism was receding, and it was the threat of individualism that was the incoming tide in late modern culture. And I think that both Pope Benedict and Pope Francis carry forward this emphasis on the dangers of exaggerated individualism more so than exaggerated collectivism. The dictatorship of relativism, I think, should be seen as a strategy to keep moral truths at bay so that we can be free to do as we please. This is this false view of freedom that John Paul II was so concerned about. So the dictatorship of relativism ministers to this kind of exaggerated individualism. And of course, in his recent encyclical Laudato Si', Pope Francis talks about the spirit of technological domination that he thinks characterizes our late modern culture. And this spirit of domination feeds into this, or encourages this exaggerated individualism. The whole world, not just other people, are raw material for me to pursue my own projects and interests. Now, I think that this is probably a correct reading of the 20th century. And that I think that probably the best way to think about the 20th century is as a kind of phase of consolidation and collective impulse that seems to reach its high watermark in the mid-20th century, and that since World War II we've been in a phase of disintegration of collectives and the assertion of the individual above all things. And so I think that this is probably correct on the part of the Church's change of emphasis has reflected a change in the cultural conditions of our time. And so that if we see the twin imperatives of freedom and solidarity, that where the church under Leo and subsequent popes emphasized freedom, not to say that John Paul II didn't also emphasize freedom, but that we've reached a point where there's a greater and greater concern among Catholic leaders about the threats to solidarity. And in fact, I would submit that that's correct, that this exaggerated individualism is now a greater threat than exaggerated collectivism. We can talk about that in the Q&A if you wish, whether this is the right way to analyze our moment. But I think it's important to recognize that these things are both two sides of the same coin, exaggerated individualism and exaggerated collectivism. It's typically, as authentic forms of solidarity erode, I think, this leads to a kind of populist collectivist reactions as people desperately seek to renew their connections to others, although often do so in ways that are artificial or ideological rather than traditional or natural. And so that it's not, in fact, I would argue that populism is a uniquely modern political response to the loss of community, to the losses of traditional forms of solidarity. It's a kind of uniquely modern and ideological form of solidarity, and therefore has some elements that are healthy, but could easily become a very unhealthy and artificial form of solidarity, and therefore very destructive. But I think it's especially right to see exaggerated individualism as our problem, because if we look at our moment, I think it's fair to say that we live in a dissolving age, not a consolidating age. That marriage and the family are in decline. The fundamental human experience of solidarity is the marital bond and the familial bond, and that this is very much in decline in the West. Local institutions have weakened, especially in poorer communities, so that in a place like Baltimore, Maryland, I think where there were riots last year, there are very few functional local institutions. Even the churches have receded in many of these communities. Local economies are absorbed and swallowed up by the global economy, which has its own consolidating function, but it doesn't tend to promote solidarity. Mass migration today threatens to transform national identities. And I think that this is another way in which we feel the power, or we feel the dissolution of stable things. And all of this atomizes people. All of these dissolving tendencies atomize people because they erode natural forms of solidarity. And I think if we look around, I think we could, even if we examine our own selves, I think we could say that we tolerate fewer and fewer unchosen obligations. I would argue that solidarity is primarily the experience of unchosen obligation. These are obligations that we don't elect, but obligations that come upon us by virtue of our relations to others. Just think about having children. Many people do not want to take on that obligation. Or we now view children as a choice. So children are not an unchosen obligation, but a chosen obligation, I think, for the first time in human history for the majority of the population in the United States. People have always chosen not to, people that have religious orders and so forth, or for other reasons, but at a mass level, I think it's unprecedented for people to regard children as a choice. And I think it just speaks to this dissolving quality of our time. It epitomizes for me this dissolving quality of our time. Now, John Paul II thought we needed to address the anthropological heresy at the root, and we had to get our view of the human person on a proper footing. I guess that might reflect a philosophy professor's view of things. It's certainly true, that would be a good thing, but I'm more, maybe more practically oriented and think that we have to address things at a slightly different level. And the first is a little bit of self-examination. I think the church herself needs to recognize that she participates in the exaggerated individualism of our time, adds to the exaggerated individualism of our time. Human rights has been a big priority for the Catholic Church since the end of World War II. But that it's important to realize that this is a priority that accentuates the individual. The human rights are by and large designed to protect us from communal forms, collective forms, solidarity. In other words, if a solidarity that would compromise our human rights. And so it tends to atomize, human rights tends to atomize, and it tends to set the individual over and against the community. The notion of a world governing authority, which has been very much desired by the Vatican, certainly since John the 23rd, has the perverse effect of weakening natural forms of authority. It's hard to imagine a more artificial form of collective action than a global one, as opposed to more local or more natural forms of authority. And then Pope Francis's revolutionary persona, I think, contributes to this atomizing quality of our time, that he has a kind of anti-institutional cast of mind that tends to weaken inherited forms of solidarity also, or participates in what I would call the sort of antinomian spirit of the second half of the 20th century that has, I think, contributed to this kind of exaggerated individualism. But I don't want to end on a kind of critical note. It seems to me the Catholic tradition has two resources within its own social teaching that I think help us meet the challenge of exaggerated individualism without courting the dangers of an exaggerated collectivism. And they are subsidiarity and preferential option for the poor. Subsidiarity, one of those big words that argues, or it's a principle that we ought to order our collective life at the lowest possible level, or with the most immediate possible authority. And this is not just an appeal to efficiency, as if I'm the most likely person to know the needs of my children, or that the town council is the most likely to know the best place to locate the city park, or how to run the local schools. It's not just an argument for efficiency. It's an argument that the human person, human dignity, requires free action in pursuit of a common good. And so that the principle of subsidiarity creates space for human beings to do what their human freedom naturally wants them to do, which is to venture projects not on behalf of themselves, or not on behalf of themselves only, but on behalf of the collective, on behalf of the unit that they are in solidarity with. The family, local community, the nation. There are different levels of solidarity that we all experience. We want to use our freedom in order to contribute to promote the common good of that social unit. Family, sodalities, local governments, and so on and so forth. I think this is hugely important. We need to renew these forms of solidarity in our society as not as feel-good, I'm glad we share this in common, but instead, shoulder to shoulder, let's solve these problems together. And not just let's vote for someone who will solve them for us, but let's solve these problems together. It's very empowering, and it's a very powerful experience of uniting freedom with solidarity, uniting our free agency with our service to others. And then the second is preferential option for the poor. It's a more radical dimension of Catholic social teaching. I think subsidiarity is, can be argued for on natural law grounds. Preferential option for the poor is an evangelical dimension of Catholic social teaching. But it's a mode of but clearly it doesn't require much imagination to recognize that it's a mode of social involvement that breaks the grasp of self-love and the natural preference of the strong to pursue their own interests at the expense of the weak. Preferential option for the poor calls us to break the bonds, break the grip of self-love, and pursue the interests of those who have nothing to give us in return, but only for their sake. So, in conclusion, it seems to me that Catholic social doctrine is right in its shift in emphasis, that exaggerated individualism and the disillusion of natural forms of solidarity is the problem of our time. I think that the Church hasn't done enough self-examination as to its own contribution to this exaggerated individualism, but that we have at our disposal, certainly the Church has at our disposal, two very powerful principles that we can make focal points as we engage in our political lives in this time and in this place. Thank you.